the question is, well, how does that affect me, right? How does that affect my portfolio? How do you make money on knowing where the Bitcoin dominance is going to go?
Today, I sit down with quant analyst Benjamin Cowen to discuss the real way you can make money with crypto.
And I think the answer lies with Ethereum.
We discuss Bitcoin, Solana, Cardano, and best time to buy.
So this shows ROI after latest cycle peak. That is likely where the altcoin market finally bottoms out.
So hit the like button, send this video to a friend, and let's start.
Do you want to start with Bitcoin dominance?
Yeah, I'm obviously a very big bull on Bitcoin dominance. And one of the reasons actually, and going back to something that we were talking about earlier, we were talking about interest rates and the yield curve, in the other video. But what you'll notice last cycle is Bitcoin dominance did not top out until September of 2019. Now, a lot of people have said, well, does that mean that Bitcoin dominance has already topped out because we're already past September of 2023? There's a chance. I think what's more important, I think it'll continue to go up. So I do think Bitcoin dominance will take out these highs here and continue to go up. And the reason I think that is because if we were to overlay interest rates, so I want to just overlay US interest rates. One of the reasons why I think dominance topped out here wasn't just because it was a magical point in the cycle. It was because interest rates were starting to go back down, meaning we were going to looser monetary policy, right? We're going to looser monetary policy. Interest rates are going back down. Therefore, riskier assets like altcoins could start to keep up with Bitcoin. But it wasn't until we saw looser monetary policy. Here, we still haven't reached the point of lowering interest rates. And so I think that dominance will continue to go up. And I think that because liquidity is being drained. If you were to look at total 3, this is the altcoin market. My argument is that it tracks net liquidity very, very well. Net liquidity, as I'm defining it here, is basically the balance sheet of the central banks of, so the Fed, the ECB, Canada, the UK, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and we subtract out the TGA and the reverse repo. But when you add all that stuff up, and of course, we're converting the balance sheets of these central banks to dollars. So when the DXY is going up, that means the net liquidity is normally going down because the purchasing power of these central banks, or the conversion from their local currency to USD, is becoming less favorable for them. If you overlay net liquidity over the altcoin market, you can see that it tracks it pretty well, right? Like it tracks it pretty well. And the issue is that net liquidity is still going down, right? Net liquidity is still going down. And so my worry is that the altcoin market still has a leg lower to go, right? And again, it doesn't mean that it has to happen. I know a lot of people are really hoping it doesn't happen so they can go dunk on me, which is fine. It comes with the territory, right? But this is something that I think we should consider. And I think one of the reasons why that I like to focus on Bitcoin dominance so much is because my perspective on the altcoin, well, first of all, I do think it will go down. But the other perspective that I have that's more important is if the altcoin market doesn't go down, it's only because Bitcoin showed a lot of strength first, right? So if Bitcoin were to get a significant rally, then yes, that would likely raise the altcoin market up. But Bitcoin went there first, right? So then for me, my entire, most of my crypto portfolio for the last 18 months has just been Bitcoin. I do have some crypto and it's mostly just been Bitcoin because I expect the dominance to go up. And this pattern, by the way, is actually a very similar pattern that we saw with Bitcoin last cycle, right? We saw these lower highs and we also saw these higher lows, right? Where, and again, maybe I could just very, very briefly pull it up just so the audience can see. And again, it doesn't have to play out the same way. I have to repeat myself on that because we should expect some types of deviations when looking at this stuff. It's not like it's always going to play out in the same manner. But Bitcoin had a very similar pattern, right, where it was putting in these lower highs. It was also putting in these higher lows, and you can kind of see the similarities, right, where this first arrow, that's your first sort of your low. You then come up here and tag the top, the bottom, the top, right? And then ultimately we broke down, right? And then you go look at total 3 and it kind of seems like it's doing something similar, right? This is your first, that low, you tag the top, you tag the bottom, you go back up to the top, you go back down to the bottom, and you go back up to the top. And then now the question is, does it ultimately break down? And the better way to look at this is to look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, because that gives us an idea of how the altcoin market is doing with respect to Bitcoin. And if you do that, this is the chart that you get. And the last time I came on your channel, I believe this metric was probably at like 47 or 48%. I don't remember exactly. Now it's down at 45%. So it has been moving back down. And the argument is that the altcoin market tops out when the market cap reaches parity with Bitcoin. So you can see this ratio over here is 1, right? So it tops out when the altcoin market reaches parity with Bitcoin, and it bottoms out around 25%. Right now, it's at 45%. It's also riding that 20-week SMA down. Like look at the 20-week SMA here, and look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. It can't get above it in any sustained way, right? Like it keeps trying and trying and trying, and it just keeps getting rejected. And again, the reason I think it's getting rejected is just because there's not enough liquidity. You might see one altcoin pop off, right? You might see Avalanche or Solana or Cardano catch a bid on any given day. But a lot of what we've seen is more so, it has been more so a rotation of capital just from one thing to another, rather than a lot of new money coming into the space. So, if the altcoin market did break down like Bitcoin did last cycle, then that could lead, to altcoins getting this reckoning against Bitcoin. And I mean, it could be Bitcoin going down and altcoins going down more. And you and I both know, because we both experienced it before, that is the most brutal part of the cycle when Bitcoin goes down and the altcoin market goes down more.
100%. And also the time of waiting. And you think you're finally on the next leg up, and then it's just brutal
Right.
that we take that leg down. Benjamin, what are the strongest altcoins? And I don't necessarily mean the ones that have pumped this year, unless that is the definition of strength in the future. Like I know Chainlink has done well recently. XRP rallied into the decision. Like, are there any altcoins separating themselves from the pack, like in the look towards 2024?
So we can take a look at some of them. So here's Chainlink. Let me switch this over to a log scale. So, there has been a bit of a movement here recently with Chainlink, but I still want to see kind of how it handles this, because if Bitcoin does sort of top out around like 28 to 30K or something, and it rolls over, how will Link perform? This is the Link Bitcoin chart, right? And, it's tried to break out for a long time, right? It's been trying. And so it is interesting. I think it's worthwhile to see kind of how does it hold up if Bitcoin shows weakness. And we haven't really seen that yet. We don't really know what's going to happen. So I'm still looking at it. The other thing is, if you look at Link USD, one of the things we'll note is that it hasn't really taken this level out, right? So it has been putting in lower highs here. And so I'm also, watching that as a potential trend as well. And, I'm curious if it will break out. I mean, this has been a long window where it's just gone sideways. So, I mean, Link is not, it has not been it has not been one of the ones that has outperformed recently. Maybe if the definition of recently is the last month, then yes, it has, right? But if the definition of recently is since mid 2022, it's basically just been stuck. Maybe the fact that it hasn't gone down more since May of 2022 is maybe the bigger news piece. So maybe that could be argued as showing some signs of resilience. There's been some other ones that have been talked about a lot. I think Solana, XRP. Solana is an interesting one to look at, because if we go take a look at this chart, this shows ROI after latest cycle peak, and we're going to look at various coins, right? And what I want to do is, because there's going to be a lot on here, so let me just isolate a few of them so we can see what's going on. This is what Solana looks like, right? So if I can find it on here, this is what Solana looks like as measured from the peak. As measured from the peak, current ROI is down about 91% from the peak. What's interesting is it took a very different path to get to where it is today. ADA and Solana are both essentially at the same drawdown from the peak, right? So if you measure the returns of Solana from the beginning of 2023, Solana has outperformed ADA significantly. That's an undeniable fact, right? But it's also an undeniable fact that one of the reasons that Solana has outperformed ADA since the beginning of the year is because it got wrecked a lot harder at the end of last year. So arguably this move by Solana is more so just mean reversion, right? Back to whatever the general trend for the altcoin market is. And we can look at a lot of the layer ones, right? Like look at Polkadot, it's right there with that same group, right? Look at Avalanche. They're all right there together, right? So what this tells me is that there's all sorts of narratives about, you know, all these altcoins and whatnot, and the communities and all this stuff, but this shows me that that stuff doesn't matter nearly as much as liquidity matters, right? Because all these coins can sort of point to something that is slightly different about what they do over what someone else does or over what another chain does. At the end of the day, it hasn't mattered. The different fundamentals of all four of these coins, they're all down about 90% from the all-time high. And so I would at least sort of look at Solana in that light. One other way I think that might be, and this is probably my own fault for not talking about it in this manner before, is I normally just look at Bitcoin dominance, right? And I make videos on Bitcoin dominance that are far too long for people to stay interested. But one of the things about Bitcoin dominance is that for a lot of people, it's just this nebulous number that doesn't mean anything, right? Like 40% dominance or 50% dominance or even 60% dominance, right? The question is, well, how does that affect me, right? How does that affect my portfolio? How do you make money on knowing where the Bitcoin dominance is going to go? And I think the point of it is, if you were to go to say, like, let's go to the ADA Bitcoin chart, and then let's inverse it. So we're going to look at the Bitcoin divided by ADA chart. At the beginning of 2022, right? Let's just take it from 2021, right? August 2021. In August of 2021, one Bitcoin was worth about 16,000 ADA, right? So if you took one Bitcoin and converted it to ADA, you'd have gotten about 16,000 ADA. If you converted one Bitcoin to ADA today, you would get 105,000 ADA, right? So that really shows just why dominance is important, is because just having kept your crypto portfolio mostly in Bitcoin over the last year and a half, or whatever exposure you wanted, you likely could then go pick up that altcoin with your Bitcoin for, you know, and get a lot more of that altcoin while still maintaining exposure to the cryptoverse via Bitcoin, right? So, like, look, again, one Bitcoin used to be worth 16,000 ADA. Now one Bitcoin is worth 105,000 ADA. And maybe I'll just give two more examples. Let's go take a look at Solana. So Solana, if we look at the 1 over Solana, so if we just look at the Bitcoin Solana valuation, back in late 2021, if you had converted one Bitcoin to Solana, you would have only received about 234 SOL. Today, you would get almost 1,200 Solana, right? So that's the importance of Bitcoin dominance, right? It's the recognition that a lot of these altcoins are just bleeding back to Bitcoin, and that by keeping your exposure to crypto mostly confined to Bitcoin, then your purchasing power to obtain those altcoins should go up significantly. So what I'm looking for is Bitcoin to sort of get this, continue this secondary scare that we've talked about. It could be due to a recession. And that's what leads to those very low valuations in the altcoin market, where, converting a little bit of Bitcoin can go a long way in helping people accumulate altcoins for the next cycle.
And by the way, if anybody at home wants access to these charts, I will put my affiliate link down below, Altcoin Daily, 10% off. But Benjamin, that's how you would have made money 6 months ago, trading that Bitcoin dominance. If you're trying to make money today, is your thesis, we might not go up the other 50%, but we might have 20, 30, 40% still to go?
I think the dominance still has about 10% to go up. Looking at averages, if we were to look at the average of dominance without stablecoins of Bitcoin, so this excludes the stablecoin market. But if we look at the current cycle, 2023, this is what it looks like, right? And I want to average out the last two pre-halving years, 2015 and 2019. I think this is going to play catch up. And, you can see that in that year, if you average out those two prior years, the dominance went up about 25% from the yearly open, right? 25%. We're currently at 1.15x. So there's still about another 10% move to go. And some people say, well, where's that 10% going to come from? Because if even if the altcoin market breaks down, like they're so low market cap, how could it possibly have that large of an effect? And I think the answer lies with Ethereum. So the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, I think, is where the answer lies. And I've said this many, many times as well. And I know it's not a popular view, and it hasn't been a popular view, but the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation was putting in new yearly lows like yesterday, right? So the view of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation being in a downtrend has not been wrong, right? It has been the correct view. I think the issue is what happens if we break this to the downside. And my expectation is that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation will break down to around that 0.03 to 0.04 range. And I think that'll go a long way in bringing that Bitcoin dominance up. So that's what I'm looking at. And look, I know the counterpoint to this wedge is that some people might say, well, that's a bullish falling wedge that could break to the upside. They could be right? They could be right. But I think fundamentally, at least for my own, like, especially with Ethereum now, it's now, at least temporarily, it's become inflationary, right? There's not enough activity going on to offset the issuance anymore. And it's starting to become inflationary again. It's still nowhere near the supply that it was at the merge. But if the lack of activity today goes on for another 6 months, then it could go back up to those levels. So that's what I'm looking at. I do think we will get another move by dominance to the upside. And one last thing about the dominance, because this is something that I think a lot of people might not be aware of, is the move from 50% to 60% could happen very quickly. And if you don't believe me, the move from 60% to 50% happened in 1 month. In 1 month, from 60 to 50. And the reason, that's when the Ether Bitcoin valuation went up a lot, right? Like that's April of 2021. You can see what Ether Bitcoin was doing here, right? April and May, Ether Bitcoin was going up. What happens if it goes back down to 0.03 to 0.04? That's how you get the Bitcoin dominance to 60%. And that's when the accumulation phase finally starts, in my opinion, for the altcoin market, at least with respect to Bitcoin. And with that said, there are some altcoins that have already probably put in their lows on their USD pairs, but most of them could still go lower. And if they don't go lower on their USD pairs, and there's a really high likelihood still that they would go lower on their Bitcoin pairs, because Bitcoin normally leads the bull market.
Benjamin, I love it. I want to have you back in a few months, revisit some of these charts, look forward into 2024. Let's flip the cameras just solely on us. And final thoughts for the Altcoin Daily Army.
Yeah, I would say just, hang in there, right? Like this part of the cycle is really hard. I think it's hard on everyone. It's hard both on bulls and bears, right? If you're a bull, especially if you're a bull in the altcoin market, it's hard. If you're a bear, I know a lot. Look, bears are bulls in waiting, right? Like they're, a lot of the people who are bearish on the altcoin market are not, perpetually bearish, right? They will likely eventually become bulls. It's just a matter of time. So I am very bullish on the cryptocurrency asset class. The reason why I sort of operate the way I do is because I've seen just how badly altcoins can get wrecked, and they can get wrecked, even 2.5 years after Bitcoin's all-time highs. We saw that last cycle. I think we're watching it again happen now again. And I would be looking for liquidity to return. So when you see the recession headlines, like once those recession headlines come back, which I think they probably will within a few months, that is likely where the altcoin market finally bottoms out. And the reason for that is because recession headlines mean that liquidity is going to start coming back. And we know that altcoins are mostly a function of excess liquidity.